And this is the topic of our webinar today. We do these webinars about once a month and have sort of a different emphasis. The emphasis for our webinar today is how does CMI fit with other therapies? And so we want to talk about how CMI it is a standalone therapy. It does exist as its sort of own in a vacuum approach and process for helping folks of various, we've seen a lot of folks with a huge range of presentations, and CMI works in isolation with those issues, with the presentations. CMI also plays nice. This is something I said earlier on. CMI plays really nice with a lot of other therapies. One of the things I do interviews with folks who are seeking internship. I work at the VA on during part of the week, and folks will come in and say, hey, what's your theoretical orientation? And you hear it often, like my theoretical orientation is kind of eclectic. I'm kind of integrative. I kind of use a lot of different things. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in picking what works and putting it together. And so I think a lot of folks have a sense of like, yeah, I like to use a little bit of this and a little bit of this. CMI is perfect for folks who like to do that. And I think there more and more of us are kind of moving away from a particular modality and sort of being tracked into sort of that one modality to incorporating and including things that work from other modalities. So CMI is in that vein where it's going to be complementary. It doesn't need to be exclusive, or we can't do any of that because it's not CMI theory or whatever. No, CMI works really well. So talk about a little bit more of how CMI fits with other therapy. It's really useful for um, it's really useful for enhancing existing techniques, and it does so by sort of providing context, providing depth. So some therapies, especially the cognitive therapies that will emphasize on so much of the ways in which we can interact with our symptoms through mindfulness and thoughtfulness and sort of intentional awareness, that sort of thing. If we bring in a component of CMI that says, hey, there's this whole sensational and experiential plane of the human experience, let's just notice that too. And so CMI is well positioned to sort of complement some of these therapies that like to emphasize the cognitive components. And so it's really easy to say, okay, there is all of this. Like I'm doing a cognitive behavioral therapy. There's all of these things going on. But also, we notice when that emotion shows up that it has value, that it has information, that it has something to inform you of. And it's not just another component of the symptomology. It's actually something that is, organic and natural and something that is meant to, like a hunger pain. It's telling you something, something there as far as information about maybe what you should do next. It's not a symptom of something wrong with you if I'm feeling hungry, especially if I haven't eaten breakfast, for example. So that's something, again, where it can provide that context and offer depth for existing therapies. The way that CMI can sort of shift focus and framing on, for example, who the individual is as, in the role of client, um, that there is a sense of self and that there is a core self that we can develop. So some therapies kind of will step, or they don't really include this component of the way in which the individual is a key player in all of this, and the way in which they have agency, and the way in which they have a um, a sense of self that when emphasized and when it's grown and when it's sort of what's the word I'm looking for? When that sense of self is um, put on and it put into focus and say, hey, you the individual, you're a powerful entity and being, and you've got these capabilities that you've yet to tap into. It's sort of understanding of, hey, I've got something to offer in all of this. I've got something to offer for myself. And it's not just a matter of like learning these techniques or identifying my symptoms or writing down, a um, a pattern of my reactions, that sort of thing, that there's something within me that needs to awaken and participate in all of this. So CMI can help with with sort of providing that shift, that focus, seeing the ways that our symptoms show up, not so much as um, aberrations or defects or something wrong, but as valuable information that when that emotional sort of pain shows up, that it's not something that there's something wrong with you, like that hunger pain I mentioned a bit ago, to recognize it as something that has value, that's something that's trying to communicate to you. That's something that can integrate with some of these other approaches. And there are a lot of other approaches that will recognize the symptoms as having deeper meaning and not just something you want to quiet or abate. Looking at some of the shared um, and or like the shared mechanics or common factors. So there are I think there are some therapies that do this really well, as far as like identifying those key components of change. We talked about memory reconsolidation a bit ago, um, where CMI can be very useful is to say, hey, there is this component of change where if you activate this network and you do so in such a way that this other network is also activated. So let's say I activate this fear network, but I'm also activating this other network of calm and curiosity and connection, and that those two networks can be active at the same time. So CMI really emphasizes that phenomenon. And that's kind of like an example of how memory reconsolidation would update that fear network. And so some therapies like prolonged exposure, for example, will do a pretty good job of activating the fear network. And it's got an approach for how that fear network over time would attenuate. With CMI and the way that CMI looks at that, doesn't take much to shift that activation of the fear network or that survival network to also activating the connection network, the curiosity network, and how much more effective that is at recontextualizing and integrating that fear network. It's really quite amazing. So CMI is, it's got these mechanisms of change that are well understood, they're well researched, they're well published, and sort of promulgated in the literature, and then they're fairly new, I suppose, in the grand scheme of things. But they really play nice with some of these other therapies that are very close. Maybe just didn't quite, because when they were developed or their emphasis didn't quite have those mechanisms laid out. So CMI can sort of dovetail nicely with a lot of these existing therapies. I think, the idea of this particular topic is that a lot of therapists have their favorite modality, have the thing that they're really good at. I really like ACT. It works great. Acceptance and commitment therapy. How can I use CMI with ACT? Um, that's something that we want folks to feel like and feel comfortable that if you are trained in CMI, it's not going to push out all of these other modalities that you really like. It's going to play nice with them. You're going to find ways to be able to integrate them if you choose. Or you can just use CMI as a standalone therapy. And we find that folks have different approaches when they take our training and when they do the CMI training and become CMI therapists that I'm using more CMI with this individual and I'm sort of integrating the other modality more with this individual or this other person I'm working with. They're just, they're not interested. They want to do solution focused therapy and just kind of keep it at that. And that's perfectly fine. So, this is the last idea here with CMI is that for whatever modality you're doing, the sort of perspective of yourself, the role that you take on as the therapist, it's one that CMI can really inform. We see ourselves as therapists as CMI therapist as somebody who is in the room providing a resource or the real expert for the individual who's making the real change in their life. And that is it's a pivot from this idea of, the benevolent dictator says, okay, it's session 3, we're 25 minutes in, we got to transition to this step of the protocol. So CMI can help soften some of those perspectives on the role of the therapist. And more than that, it can really help the CMI therapist, other therapists who become CMI therapists, really help them um, fit into their role in the dynamic of the client therapist relationship. And so, that's something that's kind of comes out of the training as well, is the way in which the therapist is so important, but also not on the pedestal or not in this sort of role of needing to be um, needing to be at the center stage. The client's on the center stage. The therapist is somebody who helps support that endeavor. And CMI does such a great job at helping the therapist not feel like they have to do the heavy lifting. They have to be the hero or, of the journey, so to speak. That's the client's role. And the way CMI helps the therapist sort of fit into that is really quite elegant and it's been very helpful for folks. Okay.
Hey, Brian,
Um, yes,
I'm
yes.
gonna jump in just because I did have a little request. I don't know if the video
I'm
is
not seeing chat if chat's coming through,
okay.
but you
Yeah.
can.
Um, yeah, just to simplify a little bit, like what makes the CMI different would be that it's very client centered. So rather than me as a therapist, like identifying what the issue is, we start with what we call the signal, right? What is the problem for the individual? And that already differentiates a little bit, but mostly we're teaching them to seek the answers from within. So we're guiding them through using the structure from how people like process experience, essentially. Like, so we're working backwards. So, for example, if a normal therapy would try to teach you how to change the way you think, right? Well, the way you think came about to be based off of your experiences, your relationships, your attachment, all of those things. That's what we call critical memories. And so instead of targeting the result, we're trying to get to the root of what caused that result. And so the theory and kind of what we're seeing is that even with things like PTSD, a person goes to a car accident and it's not the event itself, like the car accident or the assault or whatnot, but rather their capacity to be able to digest that experience, right? So if they don't have, they already have a difficulty with like feeling safety or feeling empowered, they might get stuck on that. Their brain gets stuck on certain aspects of the experience. And what makes this different, so you have approaches that like their theory is that, okay, this information is stored in the image, or we need to work with the sensations in the nervous system, or we need to work with the narrative, the story they're telling themselves. And those approaches are trying to fit the into the approach. With CMI, we're open to all of it. It could show up as images, it could show up as sensations, it could show up as a stress response, or it could show up as like a story or belief. So we train clinicians to tune into how the individual processes experience, not what, one modality might kind of stick to one way of approaching it. So whenever you go through it, yes, sometimes it might come up as what we call a scene in other modalities, or it might come up as a belief, or it might just come up as a nervous system response. So the CMI clinician is taught to tune into those things and recognize that this is a memory because there's different types of memory. It's not just one type of memory, and then work in the context of that. And what happens is that becomes a lot more individualized approach, which we've seen has been way more effective in terms of getting to the root. And it doesn't just target like the problem that they came in with, it changes the way they interact with the world, with relationships, how they see themselves, just a different way of approaching things. So hopefully that helps